Selamat datang di Gedung Slamet Riyadi, Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta dengan bangga menjadi tuan rumah Lomba Debat Indonesia tahun 2025. Ajang yang mempertemukan para pemikir muda terbaik dari SMA seluruh Indonesia. Di sini, gagasan diuji, keberanian diuji, dan logika dipertajam. Kompetisi ini bukan hanya tentang menang, tetapi tentang bagaimana setiap peserta menyuarakan masa depan. Dari Sabang hingga Merauke, para delegasi hadir membawa semangat, budaya, dan harapan. Bersatu dalam satu panggung argumentasi terbesar untuk SMA di Indonesia. Selamat datang di Lomba Debat Indonesia 2025. Siapkan argumen terbaikmu, tunjukkan potensimu, dan jadilah generasi pemikir masa depan.
Cika, dia telah lulus SMA, tapi bingung mau kuliah di mana?
Jangan bingung, mari bergabung bersama kami di Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta.
UAJY memiliki 7 fakultas dan 14 program studi yang dapat jadi pilihan loh.
Jangan khawatir, UAJY menyediakan miliaran beasiswa yang bisa kamu dapatkan. Tentunya, terdapat program seleksi yang masih dibuka. Informasi lebih lanjut dapat mengunjungi situs pmb.uajy.ac.id. So, tunggu apa lagi?
Bakal nyesel loh kalau nggak daftar sekarang.
Welcome to Yogyakarta, the city of students. The city where a significant number of public and private schools and universities are located. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta, a private university established on September 27, 1965 by Yayasan Slamet Riyadi Yogyakarta.
Dalam bahasa Sanskerta, Atma berarti jiwa dan Jaya berarti unggul, sehingga Atmajaya berarti jiwa yang unggul. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta juga memiliki semboyan dalam bahasa Latin Serviens in Lumine Veritatis, yang artinya melayani dalam cahaya kebenaran.
The four core values upheld by UAJY are excellence, inclusivity, humanism, and integrity. Excellence implies a quality or being better than others. Inclusivity means encompassing all social groups. Humanism, the definition, means to serve the common interest of fellow humans. Integrity means adherence to the moral and ethical principles, honesty, reliability, consistency in words and acts, and a sense of responsibility. UAJY supports diverse values, cultures, religions, races, ethnicities, and languages as a university with students from all across Indonesia. UAJY's diversity is an asset for further collaboration and synergy in preparing for a better future.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki 4 kampus yang terbagi menjadi Kampus 1, Gedung Santo Alfonsus. Kampus 2, Gedung Santo Thomas Aquinas. Kampus 3, Gedung Santo Bonaventura. Dan Kampus 4, Gedung Bunda Teresa. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki fakultas dengan berbagai program studi sarjana, program studi magister, dan international undergraduate program.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta is the second home for every individual to develop and share information, and a university with a high-quality education to attain unlimited aspirations and accomplishments. To achieve the goals, UAJY provides classrooms with hybrid learning system, laboratories in each faculty as a room to explore, co-working space as a discussion room, medical personnel who are always available in the university clinic room, and a library that provide books, e-books, and digital libraries to open a wide window onto the world in various ways.
UAJ selalu konsisten memberikan pelayanan yang didasari rasa solidaritas kepada sesama. Selama saya bekerja di UAJY, saya merasakan kekeluargaan yang sangat kuat menjadi dasar bagi seluruh sivitas akademika.
UAJY endeavors to develop graduates who are ethical, creative, innovative, adaptive, transformational, collaborative, and benevolent. All these are aimed to help students achieve their future dreams.
Mendidik itu mengajarkan ilmu pengetahuan dan berbela rasa serta berkontribusi pada kesejahteraan masyarakat. Hal tersebut menjadi landasan fundamental bagi Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta untuk mencetak generasi muda yang unggul di bidangnya dan memiliki integritas moral yang tinggi. Saya bangga menjadi bagian dari Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta. Viva UAJY, kami bangga ada di sini.
Semestinya engkau bisa
Mencobanya lebih bijak,
Semampunya
Hi, before we start, can I have everyone speaking order first? Starting from the prop bench.
First is Nicholas, second is Kelly, third is Sharon, and reply is Nicholas.
Give me a second. So Nicholas, Kelly, Sharon, Nicholas. Okay, in up bench.
First is Naisha, second is Nisha, third is Yoda, reply is Naisha.
Okay, Nalisha, Meisha, Yoda, Nalisha. Okay. Second thing before we proceed, this is going to be a live streamed room. So yeah, keep that in mind while you're giving your speech, while you're giving your expressions, even on the bench, because the cameras also pan at you throughout the debate. Anytime during your speech, as well as when you're giving interruptions, please use the microphone so that's audible, not to only everyone in the room, but also in the live stream. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth round of LDI 2025 English category. As the preliminary rounds commence, we wish you all the best of luck looking towards a great debate. My name is Ariel. I'll be chairing this round. Along with me were our other judges. Could you also introduce yourselves?
I'm Anna from Papua. My name is Yana from Central Java.
So refer to the judges as a whole. Please keep a timer, but there's also a timer on the screen. All of us will raise at 8:15 and 4:15 to wrap up your speech. But otherwise, let's have a great debate. Under the motion that reads, this House believes the West should provide military assistance to the SAF, we call upon the first prop. Here.
Hello, audible? Trigger warning, this might be a sensitive debate.
Panels, we are teetering on the edge of conflict. It is not just statistics, lives are dependent on this decision. If we do not do this, we will be the generation who betrays the next. One more person that we can save will mean so much more. A person who can have lost their family, their homes, and their purpose in living. That is already so important in this debate. Firstly, set up 3 crystallizations. 1. Who will be supporting in terms of the West? I think it would look like dominant countries in the West, such as the US. The reason is simple, because only countries with already strong interdependence and stability would lend aid in the first place. I think US has incentives to cut conflict because they gain diplomatic and other benefits, such as resources that Sudan can pay to them. And even if it's not a moral incentive, there is still a proper incentive for US to lend them proper aid. What is mechanization then? I think in terms of the military assistance itself, this looks like general aid, financing to fight against, but more importantly, to defend against. Note panels is important because war is not just about country versus country. Millions of lives are lost, millions of lives are at stake. And the aid is pivotal because it is the ability and actualization to defend yourself, because there's only one choice for Sudan right now. Do you want to focus on fighting against insurgency, or do you want to focus on defending your citizens? If you do not have external aid, then it's very difficult to allocate for both sides. But now, how do they actually send this aid? I think it looks like things like, say, supply credit, sending the resources through lines and actually reaching the people and the government through certain resource sectors. And this is also very important because we will provide them, say, military aid and forces to defend themselves for, say, state and private issues. But what do they want? I think the US incentive is simple, right? There will be things like, say, diplomacy or likely resources, which, keep in mind, will be things like, say, minerals. But I think we're willing to consider this and make this trade-off because we'll explain this later in our substantives why this is something that is very insignificant. Under 3 substantives: 1, the nature of intervention; 2, principality; and 3, the protected vulnerable actors. Firstly, what is the burden proposition then? I think we have to simply tell you why we end the conflict, or at the very least, we mitigate at the very least, and that we do something, that it is indeed needed. And UP has to dismantle this by telling you that intervention either doesn't work at all or will bring so much more harm. But this is 2 important questions that we have to ask in this debate. A, should we actually intervene? And B, will intervention work? Will it make it better or worse? But if we can actually explain this, I think we already championed this debate. A, should we actually intervene? The short answer is yes, under 3 premises. 1, there is a large urgency. Why? Millions of lives are at stake. Many more victims in the future, if not now already. War crimes that can be committed now and later, which will be committed, and which we'll explain later. And 3, there are no other authority to stop them, because the SAF themselves are still armed forces which are incapable of defending against a large insurgency, which does not follow any principality or humanity. And the reason is simple under the second premise. RSF can heavily overweight SAF because RSF has no social contract or humanity principle to follow. This is why they are likely to do things like, say, 1, war crimes, because so long as it benefits them, they are willing to do it. So long as it means they can win, they will kill. And that's why things like bombing sites, things like holding hostages is something that is not out of bounds for RSF. And 2, abuse of authority, because it goes against certain Geneva conventions. And they're not bound as a country. They are not bound as an organization. They're just a mercenary group. But more importantly, B, intervention from the West, right? Will it actually work? I think this is necessary as external check and balance because Sudan lacks the full capacity to defend themselves. Like I mentioned, allocation of war is difficult. Either you defend yourself or you fight against it. You cannot make do or for both. Now, if they want to do so, the only choice they can make is either one of these. I think we can see this in, say, the US and Afghanistan. When US pulled off Afghanistan and stopped their sending aid, Afghanistan regressed. They lost so much more. They had so many more external casualties, which could have been prevented had they accepted the intervention in the first place. But I think more importantly, even without this, it's very pivotal that we are able to defend as many people as possible. The intervention is indeed very much needed. But more importantly, what is the capacity then? I think the capacity of Sudan is very simple. If we can end the war faster, it is far better and so much more substantial. The reason is simple. The faster we end the war, the less people are harmed, the better we can rebuild the country, and the less people can go on, the more people can go on living their lives as usual. Why is this the case then, that RSF will be doing less harm when US or the West is sending them aid? It's simple. 1, RSF will be clearly intimidated when there is large international aid coming to Sudan's side. They will likely do 2 things. 1, they will likely have the they will likely be more passive, understanding that they will incur more casualties on their side if they immediately go in without any principle. But also RSF lacks the attack power to go against the large West. That is very clearly a reason why RSF would be then intimidated and stop very ceaseless conflict, or at the very least be much more passive. But what are the other alternatives on site opposition then? They'll likely bring you things like diplomacy or negotiations or just fighting back in general without it. We tell you it doesn't work for a simple reason. Because insurgencies don't need to follow any principality. That is the most important thing we have to tell you. This is not an official organization or a country. They do not need to follow any humanity or principles. They do what they want, even if it requires to kill people, even if it requires many lives lost, they will do it as long as they win. You are then fighting an endless conflict, because no matter what happens, as long as they have not conquered them, as long as they have not won, then RSF will never stop. That's why this aid is so pivotal. But more importantly, on proposition, this does exist. The reason is simple, because the aid allows the conflict to be at minimum even, and at best, it allows it to be dominant. It allows Sudan to actually dominate this fight at the very least. What does this mean then? We're not simply killing off everyone. It simply means then we are actually able to provide the facilitation to aid them. Because when we are able to send aid to them, it means that there's a higher opportunity and chance to then send them, say, negotiations or diplomacy to end this conflict, which is far more likely than if you had never received aid in the first place, because RSF did not believe that Sudan will be able to fight back against them for the very reasons that RSF could do things like abuse the Geneva Convention. But more importantly, I think the third thing we need to talk about here is the protected vulnerable actors on site proposition. Note that war is not as simple as, okay, we finish the fight and it's over. There are so many other external costs that comes from war, the after conflicts of war. I think this looks like things like millions of homes destroyed, many people's lives who will never be the same again, millions of families lost directly and indirectly, your friends that you lost, you yourself who are injured, paralyzed, or incapacitated because of the war. I think this is very important. This is not just about people, it's the entire country, it's the macro economy, it's the political state of the country. Everything changes after war. That is why this aid is not just to win, it is to survive, because survival is what brings these people to actually continue. Otherwise, there would have been no incentive to continue doing this in the first place, because the aid is the one thing that allows the citizens to understand that there is a chance, that there is still hope, and that is something that's very important. Hope for the people, for the citizens, that no matter what, I think it's possible to keep on living. But more importantly, for the country itself, they feel that there's a possibility, that they do not have to submit to RSF, that they do not need to meet their demands, because they understand that there is a possibility with the alliance of the West, or the coalition with the West, that they can actually fight back properly. But more importantly, I think this allows for protection, because, well, we admit, people will die. It's war. No matter what we do, people will die inherently. But at the very least, on proposition, it's mitigated for two reasons. Because we end it faster, and at the very least, we likely have more resources to opt into national defense, which might not have been possible with the sole resources of Sudan. But more importantly, what is the way in here? I think talking about the degree of impact is very simple. We protect so many more people than opt can possibly imagine, because the cost paid back to the US, like things like minerals, diplomacy, money, weighs nothing in comparison to the potential millions of lives we will save. That is exactly why it doesn't matter what the cost incurred monetarily will be, or how much we have to pay the US in return. What's most important now is the ability to dignify human. It is the ability to live. It is the ability to continue, to wake up, to live, to see another day with your family and friends. That is the most important principle that they cannot overweigh. Human lives are so much more important, and it's very inherent on site proposition that we are able to save so much more human lives, whether that be in military defense or simply ending the war so much faster. That's exactly why the burden on opposition is so heavy. You have to completely dismantle this, otherwise this case clearly already belongs to site proposition, so proud to propose.
We thank the first prop for that speech. To start opposition side of the house, we call upon first op speaker. Here, here.
The only way that proposition could win this debate is if they prove their burden that the USA can actually de-escalate and fix the problems that are happening inside of status quo, that the situation can actually reach a consensus and it can actually get better. That is a burden that they have they have put upon themselves, right? Two substantives coming from opposition then. Firstly, we're going to talk about what happens when you actually give military resources towards conflict nations, for example. But secondly, we're going to talk about what the USA is likely to do and why it's just bad and why it's likely to even get worse in status quo, right? But before that, 2 points of clarification then. I think firstly, both the RSF and SAF are violent in status quo. That is to say that they are not reaching any consensus, and that means that they are already both very, very violent in what they do. That is to say that I don't think it's right for them to characterize that that governments, that proposition idea that the RSF doesn't have like government contracts is not enough, because international organizations who oversee and like prevent these sort of conflicts in the first place are clearly not doing anything. So that means that the SAF are also probably doing the exact same amount of violence, and they are not actually following international laws, for example, right? But secondly, I'm going to talk about our stance, right? I think it's very clear. We think that when the West funds, the more conflicts are happening and the far worse the situation gets, and that means there's going to be more human rights violations. I think this is not good for the people of Sudan and just for the international realm itself. I'm going to elaborate this inside of my substantive then. Okay, firstly then, let's talk about the West. What are they likely to do, right? I think they often insert themselves into international disputes. That is to say that what proposition is said for their own benefit, right? For things like oil or natural resources, or also for things like domination, and to assert that, oh, their military is also very strong. But note panels, this is not something that they necessarily have to do. That's just that they are already getting it from a lot of other Middle Eastern countries, for example. But also, secondly, if we can look at in past precedents for like Afghanistan, for example, they often escalate many situations. They do not even make it better, and I don't think there is any past precedents of it happening. But how do they escalate, and why is it likely to escalate in the first place? I think firstly, it just means that there's going to be more weapons, right? This means that there's more capacity to be violent. There's more capacity for these two groups to attack each other, for example, or to cause violence amongst each other, right? Note that this means that any kind of discussion or diplomacy that could have happened or might happen are going to be sidelined, or less likely to happen on their side of the bench, right? But why is this likely, right? I think firstly, there's going to be more push on the idea that it's us versus them, for example, because there's no idea that there might be consensus happening, because now they're literally being backed up by an international organization, or by the USA, for example. This means that it's more likely for the conflicts to escalate, or more likely for division to happen, because the SAF has another power supporting them, right? But secondly, having more literal war resources, that is to say that it's not just medical and food, for example, but it's also having literal war resources means that you will likely ensue more violence on their side of the house, right? But the implication of this is firstly, the RSF can do things like retaliate, right? They might attack first, for example, or if they feel the need to, because they don't feel the need to finish it through diplomacy, for example, because they already know that the SF is going to ensue more violence, and they are actively getting more resources, and that means that they're slowly having a higher power, meaning that there's no a check and balance, right? But why is this likely? I think the RSF itself is very strong already. That is to say that they're already backed up by Middle Eastern countries, but also they're non-government organization, but they hold such a big power in the first place. They're not just going to simply cower just because the SAF has more power in status quo, right? Moving on then, why do we think that SAF has no good incentive in the first place? I think the very fact that they have overthrown together, but the fact that the RSF has been helping the SAF, and yet there are no agreements regarding the share of power, for example, and the fact that this dispute is even happening in the first place, that means that the SAF is most likely to want to dominate the power in the first place, right? But why is this bad when this domination happens? I think firstly, they're only going to cater to their own faction. That is to say that the nation is already divided in the first place, and this means that when they're only catering to their side, then they're more likely to attack the other side, for example, and they're more likely to not care about the casualties happening on the other side. But secondly, this means that they're going to insert a very coercive power or violence, right? They're likely to turn into violence, for example. But why is this true? This might look like how in South Sudan, for example, they have a whole dictatorship due to the fact that one military power wants to silence the other. This means that even if the government happens, or even if you're able to create a consensus, or make sure that the RSF dies down, for example, this means that there's still not going to be a good government that exists, because it happened due to the fact that there's an overpowering side of the nation that overpowers, right? But also this means that there's more power to do things like trade with other African states, and they can actually cause more instability within the international realm too, right? The implication is this then. Firstly, there's going to be more civilians that are harmed. They say that on our side, war means that there's a lot of people are dying, for example, and we think that this is a really, really horrible thing. But when you actually give more opportunities for this to happen, I think that this is just still bad, and I don't know how it's going to be any better on their side. But secondly, even if government is able to exist, and even if the government is able to exist on their side of the house, or a stable a consensus, a proper government is able to exist on their sides, it's still untrustable and volatile to the whole nation itself. Are there any PI?
Our impact is not reliant on the fact that we have governance, but the simple fact that we are going to end war. On your side of the house, civil war has been happening for 2 years. Why is the delta then?
Okay. What we want to protect is at the very least, this problem doesn't escalate. That actually is going to lead into my second argument on why it's likely to escalate on their side and why casualties are more likely to happen on their side. What are the likely outcomes of the West funding in the first place, right? We can see it from past precedents, like Proposition mentioned, that oftenly the West or like the USA, like literally goes away after this escalation even happens, right? Why is this likely? I think firstly, they only want to assert power or gain some kind of benefit. They said it, they want oils, they want natural resources. After they get those things, they're likely to go away and not actually fix the issues that are going on. And you can see this from past precedents. But also, if things get worse, the West often takes their hand off and doesn't want to be associated with these things. If this escalates, and the West is likely to not actually admit that they had power or they had a reasoning for this to happen in the first place, that they're likely to not actually help the nations after this escalation even happens. But what is the implication and why is this bad, panels? I think firstly, they have to handle things on their own. This means that status quo is far more violent and just scary for the people and for the people inside of the nation. But secondly, also note that the nations or like the international power that are overseeing these atrocities are less likely to like go in because of the fact that it has gotten so bad, right? But this is really bad because then we risk more problems and it's harder for things like diplomacy to happen because there is more violence happening. It's likely that the two groups are more likely to ensue violence among each other and unlikely to create a consensus. But even if panels that in their best case scenario, that it's only things like food or intelligence staff, for example, that they get, the SAF can use this to coerce people into taking their side. What does this look like? I think this looks like infiltrating villages, for example, due to the fact that they know that they have, like, for example, food. They have things that maybe the people might need inside of status quo. Well, not might need, they will need, due to the fact that there is a conflict going on inside of their nation. This means that they're able to do things like manipulate women into joining them, for example. This creates more atrocities during this process due to the fact that they have the power to coerce people, to kind of lure people onto their side, for example. This means that there's no kind of check and balance on why both sides are likely to reach a consensus. But why then do we think that SAF has no good incentive at the end of the day? I think it's just because of the fact that at the very first part, they were never going to want to give any of this power sharing in the first place. They didn't want this to happen. At the end of the day, we think that it's really, really hard on their side of the house for this to get any better due to the fact that you are literally ensuing more war and you are literally ensuing more violence happening inside of status quo. And I think it's really, really bad when the West is the one funding it because they're likely to back out and they're likely to not actually help in the long run. This means that they escalate and then the people and the civilians are going to be more at stake and they're going to be harmed inside of the status quo. This is so bad, panels. Proud to oppose.
We thank the first op speaker for that speech. To continue the debate, we call upon the second proposition speaker. Here.
Am I audible like this? Is it audible like this? Okay. War is never about only soldier versus soldier. War itself is a systemic violence that's always going to happen to the entire society as a whole. It does not only affect only those certain people in a certain area. War is always going to affect the entire nation. It's going to affect the most vulnerable actors that's always going to be hurt in the current status quo. First issue on this debate, whether or not we should intervene. They tell you that all the entire thing that they tell you is that US does not have the incentive to intervene, and even if they have the incentive, it is the bad incentive because they want economic gains. Few responses to this. First, US have the social contract to actually intervene inside this kind of like status quo is exactly because the US itself has the power to actually do it. But also second, that US US has the human right interest as the part of their social contract. It is entirely true that the US have the social contract to actually cater to the people who are actually in need, because they are the only actors that's able to do that in the current status quo. But also B, they have the current social pressure to actually care about this kind of like people, right? There's this social pressure within the US government itself to actually cater more to this nation and to end the war in and of itself, because they want to be seen as actually good, because they generally do not want to tarnish their image, and they want to be seen as someone that is like a good country, for example, right? But also, why exactly does US then? First, they're the only capable actors, but second, they have the right incentive to actually do this. Even if they have the incentive, like other incentives, for example, to like do like sort of like benefits, for example, we tell you that it's still fine to actually do this, because at the end of the day, we're still going to actually accept our own impact for our side of the house. The second then, on why necessarily should we intervene? First, the problem in and of itself is very bad and it's very urgent. We tell you that the war has been going on for 2 years. There's a lot of different victims in all of every single part of the entire nation. It is the civilian that is always going to be harmed on both sides of the house. We tell you that we concede on the fact that people are going to die, but at least on our side of the house, we're going to be able to end it faster. And we tell you that ending it faster is the most important delta in the current status quo. Because why? Because the fact that war happened in a long extent of time means that it's going to actually systemically break down the entire nation in and of itself. But also second then, we tell you that on our side of the house, we should intervene because we're able to create a just war. There's two different principles on a just war. First, just in bello, the fact that how the war itself is going to be fought. We tell you when it's only like SAF and RSF that's going to fight the war, there's not going to be any incentive to keep the war just, because guess what? RSF is an insurgency, and they do not have to actually adhere to any social contract. First, we tell you that the war is going to probably be better when we actually cater to the SAF, because guess what? A, they're not going to kill any innocents, because guess what? US have the direct incentive to give them regulation on how they should fight the war. But also B, there's going to be less crime done in war, because guess what? Now that you have more power, you're less likely to just like do things to the minorities, for example, or to people who are actually vulnerable, because now you can actually attack those people who are actually in power. You're actually able to attack those RSF people, right? But also second then, we tell you that the problem within the sudden status quo, something like PY.
How is it just when one side literally has more power due to the West supporting them?
I think the reason why I think the fact that war is going to happen is going to be symmetrical, and there's going to be the same amount of harm. But I think the fact that when one side of the place have enough power is going to lead to a lot more discussion. Onto my extension then. First, why then, only with the pressure coming from the West, we're able to actually lead to end the war? Because ending the war does not only mean that you have to like end the war entirely by just saying that we have to kill the entire RSF. That is not the case. War can end in a lot of different ways. It can end from discussion, for example, or when you reach a direct consensus on whether or not the power is going to go to like which side. First, we tell you why is it likely. First, there's pressure coming from the US. The West have the marginally larger capacity to actually do war. They have the capacity to give intelligence. They have the capacity to actually give this sort of like weapons, for example. And the RSF is always going to be intimidated. All they tell you is that RSF is probably going to have someone backing them, but they never characterize to you clearly who is going to back RSF. Few reasons why you think that RSF is probably not going to have any backings. First, we tell you that they are literally an insurgency. They do not have any social contract, and any large actors is probably not going to want to support them because it is just harder to control them, and it's just harder to give them regulation because there's no social contract. They can use your power, they can use your weapon, and they can use it to actually like harm the minorities, or like they harm the most vulnerable actors, for example. And it's entirely harmful because when you actually support a certain side of the war, your entire nation's name is going to be inside that war, right? And it's exactly because of that other large actors do not have the incentive to actually buy into this sort of like RSF. But also the second layer then, why then, even if they have the incentive, it is still better on our side of the house. Why even if they actually have another patron, it is still better? First, when we escalate, even if they try to tell you that we escalate the actual war, we tell you that by escalating it, we're actually ending it faster. Exactly because there's like a lot of different competition. Exactly because like proxy wars might happen. We don't tell you that it will happen, but like, even if it actually happens, we tell you that it's still even better, because when there's proxy war, there's more actual resources, and you can act the conflict faster, and you have actual competition, and you're more likely to actually like give your all, because now it's no longer about two nations, it's about your other nation, the patron's actual pride. But also second then, but also next, on why necessarily the vulnerable actors is going to be protected on our side of the house. When we have a clearly regulated war, when we know that one side of the house is probably not going to harm the minority, we tell you that it's still marginally better. Because guess what? Now half of the victim is not going to be happen on both sides of the house, because now you have actual regulation and now you have actual order inside the war. We tell you that it's still even better for like each and every single person inside this certain kind of school. But also second then, on why exactly this discussion is only going to happen on our side of the house. First, when we tell you that RSF is literally an insurgency, the reason why there's even conflict right now is because they dare to even like question the SAF, because they have the capacity and they're able to do this kind of stuff, right? We tell you that the SAF is this. We tell you that it's probably likely because of that. When we give an actual like larger power to a certain part, then they're likely to be able to dominate, and there will be actual fear, and they're not able to do that. But even if they tell you that RSF is really going to like put their all and going to do the fight, we tell that it is still marginally better, because guess what? Now the war is going to end faster. But also then, why are they probably still going to back out, and why are they probably likely to just like do this kind of a discussion? First, they have marginally less actual resources, and they are not able to sustainably maintain the conflict. The only way that they're able to win is by actually like conceding and by actually like talking to each other, or like actually do actual discussion, and you guys are able to reach a consensus. We tell that it's marginally better for each and every actors, because even the soldiers themselves, they do not want to fight. Guess what? Soldiers are also human. You also do not want to like kill other people, for example, because it is entirely so harmful to your own mentality, for example, right? We tell you that it's going to be much better for all of the people. But also next, and why then we should choose SAF? First, we tell you that SAF have the incentive to keep the current order, because they have the current social contract. They have the contract to actually be good to the nation, because they are the actual state. We tell you that the current leader of the SAF do not have the incentive to like backstab the entire country, because guess what? The past leader literally went out of favor for the country because they do something that's wrong. We tell you that in our side of the house, we are able to actually guarantee that this actual leader is going to have the best incentive in mind. Because if I knew that my predecessor failed because of their own incentive, I wouldn't recommit that. I would think much more, and I know that I'm in such fragile situation that I would think before I do something. That is exactly why it's very good. Then we flip this intent. We've also tell this to you because like the current leader have the incentive to actually do war out of fear. It is exactly because of that SAF is better than RSF. Proud.
We thank the second prop for that speech. To continue, we call upon the second op speaker. Here.
Audible like this? Okay.
It is true that the current civil war is bad as is, that you have two current factions who always hate each other and always try to start conflict with each other. But the only burden coming from opposition is to prove to you why the escalation in and of itself is just worse for the already existing civil war, why we want to stay in current status quo. I'm going to talk about two main things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about ending war and how it's just like not likely to happen, and even if it does happen, it's just bad. But secondly, I'm going to talk about saving people and why at the end of the day, proposition can save no one. Firstly, let's talk about ending war, right? They talk about two main things. Firstly, that's better to end the war faster because you have current civil wars, for example, then you already have existing victims, for example. But secondly, they also talk to you about how discussion is going to happen exactly because you have more power on one side of the bench, therefore you create disparity, therefore you push discussion because of social pressure from the USA, for example. I'm going to engage on the first point, how proposition wants war to end faster. That's unlikely because of one main reason. Because one side has to win in order for the war to end. Why is this true? Because mainly, because both sides just hate each other. They're the causes of each other's problem. Why is good consensus unlikely to happen then? Two main reasons. Firstly, because it's kickstarted by violence in the first place. You quite literally give guns, you quite literally give aid, for example, you give the one side intelligence, for example, right? Therefore, you quite literally give them an incentive to use this for violence. Therefore, it's unlikely for you to reach a good consensus when you quite literally kickstart with violence. You give them the incentive, the mindset that you have to finish this with violence. But secondly, but also, the RSF has already been betrayed by the SAF previously. Therefore, betrayal weighs heavy on the RSF. They've been helping SAF to try and overthrow or coup the previously civilian-led government, right? But all of a sudden, the SAF just left the RSF alone. Therefore, this weighs as betrayal to the RSF. Therefore, it's unlikely for the RSF to try to instigate some sort of discussion or consensus towards the SAF because they just hate the SAF that way. And they also they have their own egos to try to protect as their own faction or as their own insurgent group, right? But it creates few main impacts. Firstly, when you try to end war by just creating one side that wins, this creates one, mass genocide, because when you want to create one side that just wins, of course, then you want to have no people that in power on the other side. Why is this true? Because we can just look at South Sudan, for example, when you have two very apparent factions. There are one led by the government, but secondly, one is an insurgent group. When you give one of them more power, what the most likely thing they're going to do is they're going to try to overthrow, or at the very least, they're going to try to destroy the other side to pulp. What does this look like? The ethnic cleansing of one faction in South Sudan. That's what trying to making one side win look like. But secondly, this also looks like the people being thrown around the most, because we concede to the fact that the people are going to be most harmed inside of wars like this, or the current civil war, or when the US tries to instigate, or when the US tries to help. When the people get thrown over, what is most likely to happen is, one, you have women or more vulnerable communities being used as weapons in war. What does that mean? Is that we have women quite literally being used as tools for example, I'm so sorry, but like benefits for sexual pleasure, for example, or they use women or coerce them into believing that, hey, you could come into my faction, I'll give you food, but in return you have to give me pleasure, for example. Those things exist, and that will happen more if you make one side have more power or more aid, for example, because they can use this as leverage towards vulnerable communities. But then they tell you three other things. Firstly, they try to say that the war will be regulated, right? This is unlikely to happen because of two main things. Firstly, most of the time, criminal acts or war crimes still happen even if you try to regulate war. This is the lies that diplomacy try to tell you. That, for example, in the Palestine genocide, they try to tell you, or Israelis try to tell you, that the war there, or whatever we're doing there, is regulated. They could just hide the fact that they're doing really bad things. That has already happened before. When the US tries to hide whatever war crimes they're doing in Afghanistan, for example, they try to make it seem as if they're doing really good things, when in fact they're not. So things like regulating war is just almost impossible to achieve. But second thing they try to say, they tell you that more power could lead to more discussion because social pressure exists from the US, for example, right? The thing is that when you have South African countries who have a civil war, for example, South Sudan, for example, they don't believe in things in things like the UN, for example, or other outside West countries trying to help, for example, because two main things. Firstly, they have rampant insurgent groups who believe in certain political ideologies that are against the West. But secondly, the UN has already tried to help these things in the past, and UN has failed miserably. Therefore, they don't have the same trust they have towards other parties outside of their own area. But thirdly, they told you that just war can happen under multiple principles, but the main thing is that both sides are equal. This is unachievable because quite literally, you give one side more power, they concede to this. Because when they tell you that the RSF is most likely not going to be backed by any country, for example, no country, for example, you create more disparity between power. Therefore, they disprove their whole claim on creating a just war. Secondly, I'm going to talk about saving people and how they can't do this. Four main things. Firstly, there's one big question here. How does weapons or violence or intelligence translate into saving lives? This is contingent on one main thing, that the SAF only uses this capacity to defend themselves from the RSF, right? Why is this unlikely? Exactly on proposition, you want to save people. But also, how do you save people or protect your own faction is you have to assert dominance enough for the RSF to try to not instigate towards you, right? Because
For example, if you want to assert dominance, then you have to make yourself more stronger. You also have to make yourself seem more violent. But also, it's contingent on the fact that RSF won't even try to pursue you or attack you first, right? But also, second thing then, the RSF has power to overthrow the SAF, right? The consensus here is that violence can happen either way. There's one main thing here. One, the RSF can just assert dominance towards the SAF, therefore it creates violence. Why is this true? Because RSF is also backed by other Middle Eastern countries. This is not true that insurgent groups just have no backing because they have no policy to follow, because other insurgent groups from other countries also exist to try and support those political ideologies. What specific country tries to back the RSF is like Egypt, for example, where they have the same political ideologies and the same insurgent groups, and they try to help other insurgent groups who share the same political ideologies in other countries. But thirdly, let's talk about the conflict within the people, because we notice that the people are almost never talked about inside of the debate. There's proposition has to concede to the fact that the people are going to be thrown around the most inside of these things, that they're the most vulnerable people. They have quite literally no power in any of these. There's two main impacts. Firstly, the US military quite literally targeting local communities. Why is this true? Because when you have the US quite literally interfering, what they're most likely going to do is they're going to set up camps there, right? This looks like in Afghanistan previously, they used these camps to quite literally terrorize local communities or infiltrate local villages just for no reason whatsoever. But secondly, this also looks like the SAF using this leverage to coerce women, like I already talked before. The weighing here is at the worst case scenario, the harms are symmetric, but at best, we try to help people, we try to help the local communities or the villages there. But fourthly, let's talk about soldiers then. They told you, soldiers also don't want to fight. We agree with this fact. It's a consensus. But the response here is one, soldiers will be incentivized to fight on their side because they need more manpower. The weighing here is simply on magnitude. You have more incentive to create violence, then you also need more manpower, you need to assert dominance. I cannot be prouder to oppose.
We thank the second op for that speech. To continue, we call upon the third prop speaker. Here.
Am I audible like this? My bad. The reason opposition loses this debate is because of a very specific comparative that they never contend with within this debate, which is that the war will never end. Whatever impact they bring to you within opposition, talking about, oh, people are just still going to get more coerced, for example, is something that will comparatively happen on their side of the house. Insofar that largely, war will never end when they are equal forces. The only solution to solving their issue is if the war ends. And I know, Judge, it sounds like such a large burden to take to say we're going to end war. But I think it's a burden worth taking, and it's going to possibly happen, because just because it's a big burden, it's not going to happen. Just because it's a big burden doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Okay. Therefore, two clashes in this debate. One, I'm going to talk about the characterization of the West, because the entire case of opposition is contingent on the fact that the West will not care, the West will cause a lot of harm towards these individuals. But then secondly, we're going to talk about why the intervention itself, regardless of the existence of the West, is going to help the people in the long term. On the West's characterization, what do we tell you in proposition? We tell you that two things. The West has the responsibility and the social interest to protect you. We gave you massive amounts of analysis on this. That on the first level, the West is a large state that believes so much that they are some kind of individual. They convince themselves that that's true. That's why they intervene in so much countries and try to tell you that they want, for example, some level of democracy, some level of control. They have so many organizations that back this, that care so much about the rights of women, for example, and do this in so. But then finally, there's also a lot of public backlash within the Western countries itself, because they have incredible amounts of democracy inside, that when they decide to do something, there is mass public backlash, for example, and it does largely affect them. They can bring whatever example they want, for example, of things like Israel in the US, but I think that's a very specific niche example that is small. But if you look at the rest of the Western countries in the world, like look at UK, Canada, this still largely exists. So I think we want to talk about the very specific context of this, then yeah. But finally, I think in the context of using specifically Israel as the example, they cannot run this, simply just because Israel's context is different from Sudan's context in the very first place, and therefore the same analysis cannot run, because Israel themselves is just more economically, there is more like economic need from the US itself, and again, political need inside from the people inside the US who are largely a lot of Jewish individuals who really support the Israel state. And I think because of this, that cannot run, right? So I think what they prove to you is that there's still a large responsibility for the US to not just do the large harm that exists when opposition pushes you. But then second of all, they just tell you it's not going to pull out directly. Because if you notice the large harm within opposition, it's because they tell you, oh, they're going to pull out, the people are going to be hurt, they're not going to be able to survive. And what did they tell you? The reason that they pull out is because it escalates. This logic doesn't make sense because to the US, this is just such a small war that does not harm them at all. They have the largest military resources. And this is not just to the US, but all the other Western countries. They have a lot of military resources that exist. So the escalation itself is not going to be enough of a logical analysis to prove that they're going to actually pull out. In so far that they still have a lot of reasons to continue, right? But then in the second layer, on the things like wanting natural resources, and I think this is largely still going to be true. What did opposition respond to this? The only response within opposition is exactly because they want natural resources, they're going to put in. But yes, it is exactly because of that they're not going to pull out until everything is done and over and they can get businesses to actually invest in. They're actually going to help you solve the aftermath. They're actually going to do all of this. Because if they just because you provide them military resources doesn't mean you're going to have investments of companies inside to actually gain the resources in the very first place. So if they want to gain these kind of impacts, they're going to have to contend, they're going to have to win this war. So I think largely the West characterization coming in from opposition that says, oh, they're not going to help at all, is just largely false. And this means that largely their case on A, pulling out and causing large harm, cannot run. But then secondly, that they tell you that there's no responsibility or interest for the West to have to be the people to do this, also fails. So I think the West characterization is clear, we've been in that. Yes, that POI?
The reason why the US pulls out is because when a war escalates, you create more media publicity that makes the US look bad.
But I think the reason this is true is because that's not going to be true is because the media themselves largely also recognize that they are doing this for a good point, that the RSF is a rebellious group and there is much framing that exists within that context, that the RSF largely is a bunch of people that wants to harm. And I think this is different from other contexts, right? And even if that's true about public backlash and all those kinds of things, I just think it cannot really run as an analysis, because if that's the case, then now the public backlash needs to be large. Within opposition, they never largely mechanize why the backlash is big enough to be able to actually make the US or the West pull out. So I think largely on characterization, we still win. Therefore, I think this is just simply on weighing which one makes the most sense, and the capacity itself of the US, which is large, and the US and the West is very large. They have larger military aids, they have more information, they have more check and balance systems, and I think on mechanization itself, we're able to win. The second thing is on the intervention itself and whether it causes harm. I think there are three metrics on this. One, we're going to talk about it on the principle of just war. Second, we're going to talk about it on the impact of the citizens in the states, but then C, on the trickle-down effect of discussion. Firstly, on intervention, right? What do we tell you on the principle of just war? That the current war is not just because there is not going to be an end. Within the same characterizations of opposition, that these countries are equal forces and require and need to be equal forces, the war simply will not end. And within their same characterization that they have so much pain, so much, betrayal weighs heavy, that means they're never going to concede, they're never going to contend. Within opposition, nothing is going to happen except a continuous war. And I think I want you to think about the impacts of this, Judge. Because if we want to say that we're going to kill a lot of people, but we're going to end the war, I think it's a much better trade-off to take than saying that the war will never end and people are going to continue to die and people are going to continue to suffer and life is continuously going to be hard. I think the weighing is quite clear on this, Judge. We'd rather take we'd rather take the trade-off that right now it's going to be hard, but later in the future, it's going to be good, it's going to be better. And I know this relies on so much levels of analysis that explains why we're going to feel, why that later there's going to be better infrastructure and the state's still going to be good, but I'm going to explain that later, right? But second of all, that's exactly what I'm going to go into, which is on the aftermath, right? So what we tell you is that it is going to be good on a large scale because of the aftermath. That because the war is going to add, the aftermath is going to be good, that the states are going to be better. And this is simple, because and we gave you a lot of analysis on this, simply because then one, when there is no war, people have other things to do, they're not worried about the safety, for example, but then B, the investment that comes from all these external countries, assuming that they win this war because they have an incentive to do so, natural resources and whatnot, right? And I think because of this, largely speaking, the aftermath would still be fine. What did opposition tell you on our response to aftermath? The only thing that they basically told you on the point of aftermath was just oh, there's going to be a large amount of response coming from the SAF to commit genocide and going to erase the entirety of the RSF. Judge, I think this is largely not true insofar by historical context. They are just one. Not going to do so because they need a lot of the land and a lot of the people inside of these regions to continue to operate a lot of these things. They do not have the incentive to do so. But then secondly, because there is a large use of violence, these parties are likely also going to opt in to buy in onto this. That means that they're not going to continue to retaliate because they know that the harm is so large that there is a large amount of violence being used at the end of the day. So I think the aftermath itself is likely going to be better in the opposition side. How do you weigh this? It's simple. On the capacity and on the mechanization, that is, the West is extremely strong and the smaller countries can never actually contend. And even with the existing analysis on things like being backed by other countries, we think this is even much better because insofar that the West is strong and there are other Western countries backing, the true analysis is that the West is still the strongest part of the body. And the second analysis is that they have a continuous incentive to actually fight and actually win because there is a pride between the Western countries to actually contend to this, to actually want to beat the opposition. So I think it's quite simple. But finally on discussion, I think discussion just gets to happen in proposition simply because there is more pressure to do so. Opposition doesn't have that propose.
We thank the third prop speaker for that speech. We call upon the third opposition speaker. Here, here.
Hello? Am I audible? Okay. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The dangers of choosing one group to help over another won't matter when both groups are usually going to be horrible to their people anyway. When you choose one evil over another, when you help them, you are only simply adding more weight to one side of the scale over letting their power of both scales actually die out over time. When you constantly give overwhelming power to one side, you are also giving them too much power to actually exercise towards these people, which is why we're proud to oppose. Now, this debate is about whether this motion actually ends up helping Sudan's situation for not only the present, but also the future. Their side derives their benefits from ending the war, but our side derives it from not letting those groups get even more power to exercise among the people of Sudan. Now, we're trying to tell you that, I'll follow three main questions. First, on what side actually is able to de-escalate the conflict better. Second, what is actually creating better outcomes for Sudan? Thirdly, which side actually ends up creating more harms for people? Now, first of all, a bit of rebuttals. Now, they try to tell you that there's going to be a lot of media showing that the RSF is bad, but we also tell you that there's going to be a lot more possibility for media to show that both sides are bad. So it's also going to not really have this kind of clear metric or clear division of who is going to be good or bad. Now, they try to bring up a lot of the points of check and balances to essentially prevent things like misuse of power from this kind of SAF or something like that. We tell you that is only going to be limited to when this war is still happening. Because what is really the West's influence here? It's only as a military supplier in general. But what happens if you gave the weapons to them already? What? You're not going to be able to really take them away because you already gave it to them. But you're just going to stop really giving them power, but you're still going to have that power that you already initially gave it to them. And so this also supports our point on this US already has the West already has this limited influence in these places to begin with, which I'll go on later. Now, they try to also bring in the point that SAF aren't going to kill people because they are going to need these people to operate in these different places, and they're only going to end up killing these higher-ups. But we tell you that's going to end up creating more conflict because these higher-ups are also followed by these people in these places, and so they're also likely to end up creating their own insurgent groups, which will end up actually escalating the conflict. Now, on the first class, on the escalating conflict. Now, they try to bring up the point that they're going to end the war, but the issue is that there's going to be no guarantee to end the war when they're just simply giving more power to one side. The RSF will fight back, but there's also the possibility that with more war resources actually going around, there's going to be giving much more power to not only one side, but there's also a possibility of accidentally giving that kind of power or those resources to the other side, let's say from intercepting distribution channels or something like that, which ends up accidentally intensifying the battle. Now, another point is that it also does not guarantee ending the war, especially since the West also really has limited capacity to actually control how that war actually turns out, how these people in the SAF actually use their weapons. They can't even like control war crimes done by their own soldiers in like these Middle Eastern countries, in these previous conflicts. How can you say they're going to be able to control these people from these foreign countries and how they do in these foreign countries? Now, I'll take that POI.
But even if the US can't control, it's clear that SAF wants to win. That's the entire crux of your case. So what do you mean it's going to cause no level, it's not going to lead to our own impact?
Okay, now, I'll follow that later in my argument. Now, on a point, like, we already told you that West has like some usually bad incentives. Like, they're usually going to like insert themselves for their own benefit. Like, for example, in like Sudan, they're going to use it for like oil or like get resources, like just as they did in like Afghanistan or something like that. Now, the problem is that like there's also going to be escalation on their side. Like, for example, if the RSF sees like another enemy, especially with like the West supporting what was already their enemy, there's going to be much more provoking, and there's going to be likely that you're going to have more moves towards like RSF, but also towards the SAF. But there's also like the idea that like since the West is like giving weapons to SAF, there's going to be much more capacity for violence for SAF to actually do. Now, there's going to lead to like discussions being sidelined, and there's likely going to be like no conflict resolutions. Now, why is this likely, we told you? Well, it's going to create like this us versus them mindset, which comes from like another supporting party that's supporting one of those sides. Now, another point, there's also like discussions are already usually going to be slow in like, these kind of civil wars, and it's going to actually get worse on their side. Now, another point is that more resources and intel also leads to like more and better attacks against each other, which often really doesn't disincentivize attacks with each other when those attacks are almost guaranteed to be much more effective against them. Now, RSF, the other problem is that RSF might also be more likely to retaliate because there's like no need for diplomacy to like resolve, but also RSF is also already backed by things like Egypt or backed by countries like Egypt, which we said before, as well as like other foreign powers. This could actually end up escalating this kind of conflict to a much more wider scale. Now, even if it's like just aid, the SAF can also end up just using this to get more power, causing people who need to join like these ranks or something for their own military strength to have more power over people in Sudan, and more people gather towards the SAF for more power. So on comparative, we let the war end up like dying out because we aren't like letting resources actually go around more. And as the sides eventually will also get weaker, which will let the war die out, where they end up risking the possibility of that war actually being prolonged because more resources are going around. Now, on the second clash, on outcomes. Now, they try to bring at the point that the RSF is going to be intimidated and becoming more passive. We also tell you it's also likely that they're going to be much more violent. Because like SAF gaining more power, they're going to have more fights for RSF. RSF is going to like see more risk if they don't like fight back or something. And there's going to be much more moves from both RSF and SAF now that the fight is more tilted. Now, on another point, we tell you that like West funding end up like swaying the tides of the conflict as well. Now, if SAF ends up taking control, with SAF's incentive to like actually dominate, like have more domination over Sudan, it ends up being built on like these violent views. And it's often going to lead to like this dictatorship that is not like done diplomatically, especially considering they just had a civil war, and the one who steps out is usually going to be one to have more power. The one who is part of the SAF going to usually. Like, for example, South Sudan. You could just end up choosing which more violence wins. Don't change situation. You have often more oppression and even more killing. Now, they try to say that leaders will be good because they're going to, or they'll end up falling out of favor. But the one who controls it is the one with the most power, which is likely going to be the SAF. Now, the issue is that you can't guarantee that they will be good. The West can't have as much influence on how this SAF makes once that war ends, because that military assistance was basically just to win the war. The West is less able to actually influence further, leaving them to their own, and likely ending in like control or like abuse of power. Now, the West is likely to actually not help after the conflict because they got what they need, and someone who can be extremist can actually end up stepping up, potentially making the situation much worse. Now, SAF ends up getting stronger because they're not going to like give back those resources, and they're not going to like really share those power to others. Now, we also tell you they're going to have like this growing power, which might spread to other places, increasing influence to other parts of Africa with like things like trade or something, and creating more outlets for other extremist groups. We'd rather let the war rage on that eventually ends up weakening on both sides, rather than give one side so much power to not only win the war, but so much power to actually be able to abuse it to their own people. Now, on the third class, on which side causes more harm to more people. We already told you that's going to escalate the conflict and leading towards outcomes which leads to further harms. But how about like the entire process of giving that assistance in the first place? More military camps, because there's going to be like need an outlet for this. Military camps also influence in like terrorizing these people in these developing countries, like in the Middle East, and acts more hidden, which we already said before. But also SAF is also much more guilty of like harming innocents as well, in like especially in this civil war that's happening right now. SAF is likely going to have more capacity to actually do more harm towards the civilians on the other side, because more resources to exercise power, where they're able to infiltrate villages, have more attacks with these military assistance. Even if they win this clash because of like less war, we tell you that this ends up being worse in the for their long-term growth, because when you create a governance on this kind of war, you're only contingent to creating another war, which is why we are proud to oppose.
We thank the third of speaker, and that wraps up the substantive speakers. To start the reply speakers, we call upon opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Panels, we already told you that when you want one side to win a war, then that means that you're likely to silence and harm those who believe in the other side. On opposition, we say stagnancy is okay because we have less violent risk and we have a fair conflict that happens inside of status quo. And at best, we're able to create diplomacy happening between the two sides, but at worst, even if we don't create more casualties and more violence. I think that that's just better than whatever proposition wants to champion in this debate. Two things I'm going to talk about. First, on escalation and escalation on the USA, and then secondly, even if it de-escalates and the war ends, how would we prove that it's still going to be bad, right? Firstly, on escalation, I think proposition tells you that they're going to de-escalate since the USA or the West has such a big incentive and capacity by being an international power. How did we dismantle this argument? Two things. We tell you that the USA itself and past precedents does two things. Firstly, that they reap their benefits from military power and minerals, and likely they often do leave after. We can see this from how they left Afghanistan, for example. But secondly, they invade and help. They invade and help only to fulfill that expectation that, oh, the USA has the power to do so, and only to fulfill the expectation that the USA should do so, but then they're likely to not, to go away when this actually like gets worse, or when they no longer have the power to do anything due to the fact that there is more conflicts or more war crimes happening, right? Let's just say that the media, they tried, the media will also showcase these kind of things, and the USA probably does not want to be put inside of these narratives, right? Panels. These layers were never disproven in proposition's argument. This is a very important tipping point, right? Because in any argument coming from proposition and how the USA the USA or the West can make sure that the war is fair and just, and how the war can end in the first place is contingent on them proving this, which they haven't. We think that that means we win that clash. But lastly, then, I think our point on escalation on escalation still stands, right? Because firstly, prop never disproved that more resources means more casualties. They concede in the idea that, oh, it's okay that the casualties are happening because at the end of the day, that means the war will end, and that is good. But what have we told you? On the even if layer, that you're able to end the war, why is it still bad? On proposition side, if you're not going to harm other civilians because you quote unquote need land, because at the end of the day, this other side still has supporters, even if you like harm the leaders, for example, they have supporters, they have the people under them, then it's likely that these beliefs that RSF fight for still want to stand, then that means the government that exists is likely going to silence and harm those people anyways, and those are civilians, those are soldiers who do not necessarily want this to happen. But why do we think that that's bad, and how have we proved this? At the end of, firstly, at the end of the war needs to be done by harming people who disagree. That is to say, you're going to harm a really big portion of the society or of the civilians under Sudan in the first place, and we think that that's not a risk that we want in the first place. But secondly, this means that the outcome is that only the outcome that happens only caters to a specific group of people, meaning more conflicts can happen in the long run. That means you're not really ending anything at the end of the day. We've proved this, right? But lastly, panels, they never responded to our points on coercion on women and soldiers and how they are going to be harmed under their side. Because we've told you from the very beginning, from P1, P2, P3, we've told you that at the end of the day, when you give more resources for war to happen, for more conflicts to get even worse, that means you're going to harm more people. That means you're likely going to need more soldiers. You're going to kill more people, even though that's still bad at the end of the day. At least on our side, when stagnancy happens, when they are still disputing, it's not one that is going to necessarily overpower the other. That means they can still coexist in that way. I mean that we have proven that inside of this debate, because their risks are much more heightened, and there are much more conflicts happening on their side when you let one side power over the other. Never prouder to oppose.
We thank the op reply for that speech. To wrap this debate up as a whole, we call upon the proposition reply. Hear, hear.
What is the biggest issue in this debate? It is whether one, intervention is actually good, and two, which side protects the people. If we can outweigh up, we already champion this debate. Firstly, let's just very quickly weigh the model here. What are the impacts on intervention truly? I think the stance Prop brought from the very get-go that military aid would facilitate ending the war. Op's response is simple, that it would facilitate more violence, hence it's worse. Let's be generous and concede, even if this were true, two simple responses. Their harms that they gave to Prop is exactly inclusive, except theirs is much longer, because the war doesn't end. The comparative then on world opposition is a war with an unknown end. I think even if lives were lost because of, say, military aid, which was what they tried to emphasize on, at the very least it also ends the war, at the least mitigates it. I think we can bite the bullet on the harms they gave you, because we only take the short-term losses and we incur generational peace. I think Op is fighting a war no one knows what will end. That your father could fight in the war and later you fight in the war too. I think this is a tragic fate that you could send your father off to war and soon your son sends you off to war. I think Op tries to attempt the Prop benefits, but then their delta is very simple. Is that if you don't receive aid, that if there is still war, then what exactly is Op's countermeasure? How do they protect the people? What then is their benefits? Where do you get aid then? Where do you get national defense? Where do you get economic aid then? I think at the very most basic level, they still don't answer this. But behind the number of lives in the statistics of war is a living person with a life, a family, many memories and dreams. I think at the very end of the day, we tell you, if we can provide you this slight benefit, the chance that we can save so many more people, that is really much more important. Because I don't care about power asymmetry that they've been talking about the entire debate between countries. I want to sleep without bombshells. I want to eat with my family. That's what's important. I don't care that my government might become tyrants. I might not even live to see tomorrow. So the second problem then is the protection of people, which they never properly address. I think Op's only engagement to this is that we say, oh, when there is intervention, you hurt more people. Okay, when there is war, don't you hurt equally more people? If not more, because it's endless. You don't know when it ends. They have no guarantee to that. But due to the military equipment, I already told you, we dismantled this in the last clash analysis, right? That even if harms existed, one is inclusive and it's much more long-lasting and long-term on-site opposition. But principally, I think lending aid to people and the vulnerable is a very strong social contract. Op did not try and dismantle this. This is general principle. We want to help people, right? So even before this, they are already assuming the very worst case on-site prop, that it wouldn't work, that the intervention would simply make things worse. Two questions. What if it does work? But secondly, even if it doesn't work, why before sending the aid did you not have the principle to try and send aid then? Because that is still principle at very best. But even so, how did they respond to this? They never properly try to actually mechanize the militant aid they've been talking about, which is their alternative. They try and tell you as engagement what? That, oh, countries like Egypt will lend aid to RSF because they share similar ideologies. Even if US never sent aid to SAF, why would the ideology change? This is inclusive, right? But here's the worst part. If Egypt truly did send aid to RSF, wouldn't that be a poor reason why US would need to lend aid to SAF? Because that's the exact power asymmetry you were talking about the entire time. Now, I think even if this was true, which is very unlikely because, well, who wants to go against the US? It's very unlikely in the first place. But sure, let's just engage on that. I think even if all props benefits were out forgone, there is a clear disparity between proposition and opposition. Opposition is scared. They are scared that it wouldn't work, so they opt not to do it. Remind that. They'd rather let the war continuously run. The stakes and risk are high on both sides of the house. The difference is on a proposition, even when the risks are high, we try to make a change. We try and make it better. On side opposition, that risk still runs. The difference is they let it run with continuation, with no end. I think at the end of the day, the difference here is that our parallel at least tries to attempt to solve it. Well, opposition, with all the inclusive stakes and risks, they don't try to contend. That's exactly why we championed this debate in the first place. It was never about if intervention was going to work. We don't know how it can happen. We don't know how it will work in the long run. But we know one thing. When intervention does happen, there is a higher likelihood, which they never contend on. Where is the likelihood on opposition that less citizens will be harmed? There is still a very clear disparity in the people that we protect and the ideals that we serve and the principles that we've been trying to serve you the entire time, panels. Understand this. We are not here to talk about which side will win. We are talking about which side is able to ensure survivability, which side actually protects the people. So proud to propose.
We thank the last speaker of the debate, and that wraps up the fourth preliminary round of LDI English. Physically cross the floor and shake hands. Thank one another, and you can then continue to socialize outside as the judges deliberate, and we'll call you back when it's time for OA. Thank you.